I'm very glad that we'll be having a fantastic set of panelists with us today, including our keynote speakers from the morning, Ashish, Goel, and Krishna, Gummadi. And on top of that, we have Michal Feldman here to join us as the moderator for that panel discussion. So it is a delight to introduce Michal. She is a professor of computer science at Tel Aviv University and also a visiting scholar at Microsoft Research Herzliya. She does very interdisciplinary research spanning from computer science through to economics, game theory, and operations research. And she's been a very big inspiration for me and many others in the EC community. So it's actually absolutely a joy and pleasure to have her here to moderate this panel. She is a recipient of many awards, including Forbes' list of 50 most influential women in Israel in 2016 and the Markers list of 40 under 40. A few years ago. So Michal is a very decorated person and a wonderful person as well. And we're so glad to have her here to moderate this panel. Michal, over to you.
Thank you very much, Irene, for the lovely introduction. I'm very happy to be here. And I was very happy to attend the wonderful keynote session earlier today. With Ashish, Goel, and Krishna Gummadi. Thank you very much for the talks. I learned a lot. And I believe, to me, okay, there are different themes that I would like to discuss here with you today. Let me start by maybe raising two questions that I think were very apparent during your talks. So first of all, it's very apparent that we have a huge need to incorporate fairness notions in many of the practical applications we are dealing with today. It was very clear in both of your talks that you talked about real systems, real applications, and how important fairness notions are. And then also in Ashish's talk, he also, in the second part, he also gave us a very nice analytic model with the Fisher market and some nice analysis. And the first thing maybe we can discuss is how connected the theory, we have beautiful theory about fairness, how connected the theory is to practice. Do we actually use the beautiful models and results we are coming up with in theory when we come to design applications or to analyze applications or to run surveys or voting schemes and all the different applications you discussed. And when we discuss this, maybe I want to mention also that we have, even within our small community, we have two different communities dealing with fairness. One is that of, let me call it fair division of resource allocation, talking about envy-free notions and notions like envy-free and variants of it or other fairness notions. And then we have the other group of people doing fairness in algorithms. And it seems that the two things are so, should be so well connected, and still I don't see this connection when we come to talk about these issues. So I'll be very happy to hear your views, Krishna and Ashish, and maybe others in the panel about this issue.
I guess, Ashish, if you want to start with the first part of the question, then I can try to address the second question that Michal posed as well.
So I think some of the notions of fairness are actually finding their way in, they're very close to finding their way in practice. So for example, there's this notion of the core in participatory budgeting, which is a core is this concept of fairness, which is that any group is at least as well off in the outcome of the process as they would be if they just got their share of the money and they could do with their share of the money whatever they wanted. And we are actively trying to figure out how you could do participatory budgeting aggregation, which adheres to this notion of the core. Then in the same way, the notions of fairness such as proportionality And the method that we use commonly, our group uses, does not adhere to proportionality. But there have definitely been both experimental studies and deployments which try to sort of bring proportionality to participatory budgeting. Also, in many sort of in many commonly used rules, in social choice, there have been attempts in the other direction, which is instead of trying to take fairness and apply it to social choice, take social choice rules and analyze their fairness properties. And that result has also gained a lot of steam. And there's understanding, for example, that commonly used scoring rules can be very bad on some fairness metrics. But rules such as Copeland, which involve comparisons between candidates in terms of who beats who, those can often do sort of much better in terms of fairness. So I think there the connections are starting to emerge. The difficulty sort of, I feel, is not so much into translating theory into practice. I think the difference here is to articulate normative notions of fairness. Like proportionality is one notion, the core is another, Nash equilibrium is, Nash welfare is another. How do we figure out which of these notions of fairness is the one we should try to operationalize?
So I just wanted to maybe reflect a bit on the second part of your question, Michal, which is more about, like, it feels like there are two communities, and one, the computational social choice community that talks in terms of fair division, fair matching, and fair voting, and then there is the algorithmic fairness community, which seems to have started from the machine learning world and talks and tries to interpret things from like legal definitions of discrimination and so on, and GDPR, what does data minimization mean, and so on. So personally, I started with that. Like we started working on non-discriminatory classifiers. And at some point, I ended up actually talking to people like Ashish. In fact, once I was talking to him. I distinctly recollect. I believe 3 or 4 years ago, we were having dinner, and I was telling him about some notions of discrimination that I was wondering about. And then Ashish's comment was, "You should go look up envy-freeness." Because so we were thinking about a notion of non-discrimination in classification, where we were saying that the important property to hold is that the group error rate should be the same for the different subgroups of the population. And I was mentioning to Ashish that when we were trying these things out in practice, sometimes it feels like we're not getting, and we could do better for both groups, even if they were not equal. Or we could have boundaries where you could have two different boundaries for two different groups, where neither group wants the boundary of the other one, in which case you can not worry about this whole thing of reverse discrimination, which is oftentimes when people say that, oh, you're lowering the bar for the other group, or the other boundary is easier for the other group, kind of a thing. And ever since, actually, at least in my group, we have immediately after that, we started reading quite a bit about social choice theories and the notions of fairness there. And in fact, over the last few years, we had a lot of interesting things in terms of applying notions of fairness and sometimes even methods from that. Like, for example, in today's talk, I talked about applying ideas from fair matching in terms of the methods. And then we also did some works where we talked about looking at fair recommendations, two-sided fairness and recommendations, where we mapped the problems to fair allocation, but accepting that, and we had these notions of EF1 fairness on one side and MMS fairness on the other side, and so on. So I think this is increasingly happening. And having said that, I do think there is a lot of interesting areas to explore potentially for if people are looking for interesting problems, by actually learning more from both communities and reading the works of both communities. Like, at least for me, it has been very productive over the last few years, trying to learn more and more about the works in the computational social choice community.
Thank you. The other question I wanted to raise, something that both of you emphasized in your talks this morning, and also Ashish brought it up just now in his first answer, is the importance in the normative approach to these questions. And there are at least 3 ways to think about fairness: equity-based, equality-based, and need-based. And I think each one of these came up in your talks. So for example, in the donation platform talk of Krishna, we talked about need-based. And it was very clear to us, you know, in our guts that we need to donate more to poor areas. And the question is, there are other disciplines that may be much better suited to talk about this. And they've been reasoning about this issue for many years: philosophy, law. We have a tort law and tax law, and they've been reasoning about these issues for many years. And the question is, to what extent, I mean, to what extent are we, and when I say we, I'm not even sure what I mean by we. Each one of us is coming from a different background, but who are the people, what are the communities and the disciplines that should be involved in these discussions? And in some sense, without involving them, it would be maybe very artificial to reason about these issues.
So, I mean, clearly, philosophy, law, social scientists, computer scientists, algorithms people, economists, clearly everybody has to be involved in this conversation. But I don't feel like any community that I have interacted with is actually currently well suited to answering these questions unless they change their approach a little bit. So people like me, for example, just taking me as an example, fall too much in love with stylized models and are often sort of want like short models that we can analyze, except perhaps very long articulations of a normative principle, which are harder to operationalize. And so that's a flaw that I think the algorithms/economics community needs to overcome. A lot of social scientists take the world as given and critique it as given. And they're used to sort of giving a lot of nuance about the world as it currently exists. And whereas they need to develop more of an engineering mindset, not just analyze the world as is, and sort of point out normative principles which are incremental, which can incrementally guide the world to where it is in some positive direction, but to articulate principles which can be used in a design of a new system. For example, you're doing conversations on a social network which didn't exist. What normative principles guide free speech in that setting? And that's also sort of the problem with social. That tends to be the problem with a lot of the social science community. A lot of philosophers are sort of not used to operationalizing things, and the law again regulates things that exist. And somehow a lot of regulators are not that, have to sort of find this way of again designing regulation for what could exist. And I think a lot of social scientists recognize this, and more they're getting comfortable sort of thinking in a design framework as opposed to an analysis framework. And I think more and more people like me are realizing, I mean, I don't know how to overcome it, but I'm at least realizing the deficiencies of my approach.
That is such a well-articulated answer that I'm wondering what else to add to it, because I think Ashish really covered the whole space quite well. I guess the only thing, if any, I would add is maybe in defense of I completely agree that in difference of very disciplinary approaches, it's very clear that interdisciplinary approach is the solution, is very much needed, right, in terms of understanding and talking across the disciplinary boundaries. But sometimes there is and this might be a strange position for me to take, but sometimes I feel that some disciplinary people come under too much of an attack, in the sense that, of course, I think there is value to having at least a few disciplinary people in academia that are exploring the limits even in stylized models. as long as it is very well understood that these are not meant to be applied in the real world right away, right? Like I feel like sometimes I think right now I feel like most people appreciate that this requires an interdisciplinary approach, but at the same time I do think sometimes there are benefits to having maybe disciplinary approaches, because the stylized models do offer some interesting templates to think about afterwards. That's the only small defense that I wanted to make, even though I don't do much of those things. Maybe because I benefit from reading those things, I appreciate the value of those works quite a bit.
Yeah. So Krishna, speaking of design, Krishna, in your talk, you talked about interface design interventions, and that was very interesting. And maybe more generally, the approach of behavioral economics and nudges. And I wonder to what extent you think that interface design interventions are different than other types of interventions. And to what extent can we reason about these nudges and behavioral economics notions in maybe our analytic toolbox and mathematical notions? And maybe even, I'm interested to hear even specifically about the donation platform application and more generally too.
Yes, so I should, yes. So the topic of nudges and choice architectures has been studied extensively by behavioral economists, right? And in fact, the multiple people who have won Nobel prizes in economics for that work, like Richard Thaler and others, and going back even Tversky and Kahneman and so on. Initially, I guess the one thing that got us excited about thinking about the online donation platforms is that anytime you're talking about nudges, there are these big epistemological questions that come up as to like, are you nudging people in a way that is in their best interests, right? And then comes all these other deep philosophical questions about who gets to decide what is best for someone. And one of the things that attracted us, at least me, to online donation platforms is the hope that we could make an argument that nudging donors raises fewer of these ethical questions, in the sense that donors are essentially donating money. And maybe we could make this argument, and this may be a provocative one, that at the end of the day, the donation requests are not really affecting the welfare of the donor as much as the welfare of the recipient. And therefore, maybe there is an argument to be made that you don't have to worry too much about the deep epistemological questions that come in general anytime you talk about nudging, and about in terms of like freedom of choice and those sorts of things. And if you're willing to buy that argument, then comes the whole set of questions about like what constitutes equitable donations, what constitutes a donation request, or how do we determine the deservingness or the need of a donation request, and so on. And that was the reason why we were attracted to think about nudges in that particular topic. Though I would love to get some feedback on whether people buy or agree to this fact that nudges raise far less concerns when you're talking about nudging rich people into giving up their money for charity compared to other situations, any other situations.
So in other words, you're saying that maybe in these two-side markets, maybe we should think more about fairness on the side of the recipients and not on the side of the donors. And then it's more like thinking about the fairness of the outcome just from the side of the recipients. It still raises many questions of fairness, of course, but you are suggesting maybe to restrict the reasoning about fairness to the recipient side, if I understood you correctly.
Yes, yes. And that is maybe a provocative stance to take, but I feel like there is a clear I feel like the welfare of the recipients is clearly being affected by the choices that the donors make. And maybe we could argue that their welfare is not being too affected by being nudged to make a different kind of donation choice.
Yeah, to me it feels a little bit like it's a bit strange for me to think about it as a binary thing. Either we are talking about resource allocation or about donation. It seems to be more like a spectrum. And it may be kind of a slippery slope to think about it this way, but it's an interesting view. Yeah, and in some sense, it may simplify the thinking of these types of markets. Ashish, yes. You also talked about two-sided markets, I believe.
And not really. So the markets that I was interested in was there were voters on one side, and there were decisions on the other side, or the two sizes were really like two sides of an issue, and the issue itself has no utility. So in that sense, it's not a two-sided market. Is the decisions that have different utilities for different people. But I really appreciate this conversation about nudges, because I think what the two of you talked about really illustrates something that at least wasn't transparent to me from Krishna's talk.
Yeah, I wonder, for example, you mentioned Richard Thaler and behavioral economics, and I keep thinking about the endowment effect, for example. So we can think about the endowment effect, how people tend to inflate the value of goods they already have, and we can actually take advantage of it. And there are some studies showing how we can think about equilibrium notions, or just in a sense, it almost feels like tricking people into thinking they have more than what they have. And it seems to me that fairness, thinking about fairness from normative principles may be also relevant when talking about other notions in behavioral economics, such as the endowment effect or other types of biases.
Yes.
Another really different, just for the sake of time, I think we only have a few more minutes, and I was really curious to hear more from Ashish about the issue of unsupervised minority that you mentioned, like defining minority based on their opinion. And I wonder if you would be willing to elaborate a bit more about it, because we didn't really have a lot of time during your talk to hear more about it.
So for us, it was a really exciting direction, because it circumvents sort of many of the questions about having to define demographics up front. And also, if you assume that what matters is, if your view towards fairness is more epistemic, and by that which I mean more outcome focused, then you want to make sure that minority voices, minority opinions get heard. And those minority opinions often come from very surprising quarters. Now, unfortunately, that approach worked really well in that setting, but our attempts to replicate it have not really been successful. And I think the reason is that to apply this unsupervised minorities approach, I don't quite know what the formal threshold is, but there needs to be some threshold about how much information you know about somebody. So for example, the unsupervised minorities approach will work in the Austin kind of experiment. Within the Austin kind of, in Austin, there were lots of issues that we got people's opinions on. And also people there sort of naturally fall into 2 or 3 clusters, just eyeballing it. People fall into this one cluster of people who want to reduce police funding and want to sort of spend that police funding on health issues and on public housing. And there's another cluster of people who sort of want to keep public funding as is, but want to just reduce expenses across the board. And so in general, sort of there's a sweet spot which I've not quite been able to articulate of where the complexity, where the questions, you're asking them enough questions and there are few enough clusters. And in the middle of these two experiments, the crowdsourcing one in Finland that I described and the one that we did in Austin in 2020, we ran like around 100 participatory budgeting elections, and we couldn't really sort of find good evidence of clustering there. And so this is one of those tools which, when it happens, is very informative and beautiful. But unfortunately, in many elections most of the elections that we ran, we could not find these unsupervised minorities.
So, can I ask a quick question to Ashish? So, Ashish, you were raising some normative questions about some groups of people participating more and being more vocal and so on. In these things, do you also allow for vote delegation? Like in liquid democracy kind of platforms, that you can do this sort of vote delegation for policy specific time for a time period, or you can, are those sorts of things used in your?
So we've not been able to sort of, at least we haven't been able to model liquid democracy or delegation when it comes to things like giving people more voice or doing more fair allocations. The one that's been studied more is this notion of a storable vote. And it's a notion due to Casella. And what they do is that instead of voting now, you can just save your vote for later.
I see.
And that gives people some ability to be able to store their vote for a later election. Now, formally, that turns out to be no different than one person, one vote. But informally and in practice, that does seem to have like a lot of promise.
So I think we are running out of time. Thank you very much, Krishna and Ashish and Irene and Anna and everybody else on this panel. Thank you for inviting me to participate. And I think we should continue to the next session.
Thank you, Michal.
Great.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Michal, Krishna, and Ashish.